So I think okay. So for the interest of time, it is already 2:40. I think we should start and more people will find the room. But I think we have a good number of people here. Um yeah. So welcome, 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 welcome. I am so excited to see each one of you. My name is Paola Martinez, and I am co-chair of the Institute. And, it's a long story on how we got this initiative off the ground. But I am so happy just to see that we are doing our inaugural conference, and that and to see all of your faces, and also to see the interest that a lot of people expressed to participate in these conversations. So grateful to have our panelists and each one of the individuals who will be presenting today. And just to frame the conversation, I will read through my notes. We have 6 presentations. Each one will be approximately 10 to 15 minutes. Welcome, keep coming, you're welcome. Each presentation will be about 10 to 15 minutes. Originally, we proposed to do the questions at the end. I think that seems fine, but I also do not discard the possibility that if the presenters have concluded and you have a burning question, something that you want to ask, if that's fine with the presenters, I think we should take the questions. I hope to see each one of you with us through the end of the presentation, but I also understand that people have, responsibilities. So feel free to walk in and walk out of the room, but out of respect for the presenters, one thing I will ask is that you turn off your cell phones, you put them on silent mode, and that let's be respectful. This is a safe space to share ideas, so that please also take that into consideration. Now, without further ado, I would like to welcome you to our panel, and I would like to just say a few words to frame the conversation, right? We know that education plays a critical role in setting immigrants and refugees up for success during the resettlement process. Immigrant children and youth face many obstacles that hinder their ability to thrive in K through 12 educational programs. The recruitment and retention of immigrants and refugees in institutions of higher education are fraught with challenges. Educational institutions often lack the resources and know-how to address these challenges. Speakers will examine models and best practices for removing barriers and facilitating access to quality education for immigrants. The replication and scale up of models programs will be also explored during this panel. And we have amazing presenters with us today, and I'm glad to get to know some of you. So thank you again. To present on the issue of recruitment and retention of resettled refugees at institutions of higher learning in upstate New York, we have Vera Ekarius Kelly. She's professor at the Department of Political Science and International Relations for Siena College. Thank you so much for being with us today. To talk about the role of higher education institutions in providing education and support to refugees and immigrants, we have Sveta Dobreva. She's an immigrant integration fellow at the Institute on Immigrant Integration, and also to speak about examining in state tuition, state aid, and certification policies for undocumented and immigrants in New York. We have Cynthia Nayeli Carvajal. She's director for the undocumented and immigrant students programs at the City University of New York. Where is Cynthia? Good to see you again. To speak about accessing quality education, local and global perspectives from refugees, we have Caroline Rakus Woksijowski. I practice on my way here. Just kidding. Monitoring and evaluation specialist for MapWorks Learning. Thank you for being with us today. And what are my folks from the CUNY Initiative on Immigration Education? Okay. So we have Tamara Alsace, Associate Director, Associate Investigator, Cecilia Espinosa, Associate Professor, and Tatiana Klein, Professor for the Bilingual Education and Teaching English to speakers of other languages from the City College of New York, my alma mater. Yes, and we also have Farah Said, project researcher from the CUNY IIE initiative. Also, to speak on the issue of building from strength for asset-based initiatives aimed at helping immigrant communities thrive, Margaret Blashy, advisor and instructor for early childhood special education and bilingual programs at the Bank Street College of Education, Graduate College of Education, and Alberta Conte, director at Bank Street, as well as Karen Shatfield, associate director for the National Center for Children in Poverty for Bank Street Graduate College of Education, and Cristina Medellin Paz, Associate Director for Strauss Center for Young Children and Families at Bank Street College of Education. So this is a conversation between practitioners and people who are doing amazing research. The purpose of bringing you all together is also that we can know what each person is doing, the research that you're doing, and what you are seeing through this research, so that we can, of course, collaborate, influence policy, and therefore, as we hope to and as we aspire to, create change. So I would like to welcome Vera Ekarius Kelly to be our first presenter for the evening.
Thank you, everyone. I know this room is full of experts, and so I just have a few things I want to say. One of the things is while I work as a professor, I'm also a academic community engagement scholar in residence, which means that I work with group of students in community in Albany. That means I've worked with the Refugee Welcome Center, with RISE, with USCRI, with my colleagues at Russell Sage. I run an initiative at Siena called ECAR, Every Campus a Refuge, as well as also my colleague Nana from Russell Sage we're partnering on hosting refugee families once they arrive in the United States on our campuses. So at Siena College, which is a community of about 3,200 students, we had a refugee family from Afghanistan for 18 months as a member of our community. So parents, 2 children, one was born on campus, which was an experience for me, as that's not really in my role as professor, I must say. I expand my expertise in various areas, but great experience, and they have now transitioned out to a new kind of, a new home, and they're thriving. So I just want to talk a little bit about why I thought, along with my colleagues from Russell Sage and other community members here, about the kinds of questions that I think are, let me see if this works. Nope, nothing happening. Where am I? Green button? Yep, I'm pressing green button and nothing happened. That's okay. I mean, see, I'm glad the tech people also have an, okay. No, you can click on here. Okay. I go to the, there we go. I'll do that. Okay, research question that I have. So as part of the project that we all are working on is figuring out the question of why we have so few students with a refugee background in our colleges. Now, a school like SUNY Albany has significantly more, but I come from a small private liberal arts college, as well as my colleague from Russell Sage, and we have fewer students coming to us. So the question that we had was, why is it such a difficult journey for students with a refugee background to actually enter college. When I say students with a refugee background, I mean students that have fairly recently arrived, the last 2 or 3 years, and then attempt to go to college. They're refugees as accepted status, and they often are arriving in our communities, and they're, they don't experience the outreach that they should. So in the literature, if you review it, there are significant gaps in terms of our knowledge. We don't know much about what's happening in the upstate New York area. Some cities are significantly better. My colleague from Buffalo knows there are some, more research in certain cities. Albany is not very well studied in many ways. The literature in general talks more about refugees that are either in camp somewhere else and what education access they have or don't have. There's a lot more information on European, Australian, and British universities as there is on US universities. And so there's a huge gap in the literature, I would say. So my methodology, I do ethnographic work, which means interviewing different kinds of people, meaning specifically for data collection. And I do open-ended interviews, which means I don't have all the questions written out. What I have is some general themes. And I ask students in this part, in this study, students, what is your experience with trying to apply for college? What colleges are you looking at? What are you worried about? And they tell me what their experience has been. I also do small team approaches. So we had a group of, for the past several years, AmeriCorps students that were trained in ethnographic interviewing styles, and they participated. So it's not just one-on-one. And it's also, let me go back to this. It's also educational access workshop and informational classes in community. We found that very helpful. You serve a meal, you invite community members, and they can ask questions about what it's like to apply for college. We have financial aid people there. We have just faculty there. We have community members. Anybody's interested in having that conversation can attend. So among the participant group 1 are 18 plus, so adult students with a migration background. I have a hard time calling people refugees for a long time because I learned along the way that refugees don't want to be called refugees because they have a whole larger life and they're not permanently defined as such. They are often in the literature then described as newcomers or immigrants in a variety of ways. So if you look at the participant group, you see a variety of community members that are particularly relevant for the Albany, Schenectady, Troy area. So Afghans, Burmese, Congolese, South Sudanese, Iraqi, Syrians, Yemenis in larger numbers. The second participant groups relates to college and university admin and professional staff that work at 2-year colleges, 4-year state and private, right? So here is a quick way to think about the kinds of students I was talking to, along with a number of other participants. Of course, currently enrolled students, great, they already made it to college. What made them succeed? We want to find out what barriers did you overcome? How did you manage to come? We do that at 2-year institutions, we do that at 4-year institutions, and we figure out, how did you get in? And how was it graduating? Did you have a difficult path? Did you have help along the way? How did it work out? On the other side, we have students that are aspiring students. Those can be any age. And I found in my interviews that a lot of aspiring students are actually significantly older than what I would consider the traditional college crowd. They're often single moms in their 30s they had a disrupted educational path, and they would like to come back and learn skills and finish their education and so on. We also have discontinued educational status. I'll talk more about that, which means basically that they attempted to go to college, they did a semester or 2, and they dropped out, they got a job, they're never returning, or they feel discouraged. And then interrupted educational status is those where people take a break and then try to return. Sometimes they're transferred to a different institution. The comparative approach is professional staff at 2-year and 4-year colleges. So we, as our team worked on this, we talked to admissions people, ESL, ELL people, educational opportunity programs, academic support, international programs, and then spiritual life or, faith-based programs. Here are some really interesting walkaways. Admissions officers generally have no idea. ESL people are focused on international students. Academic support needs more information about how to support refugee students. International programs are a disaster to put refugee students in because international students often come with a significant amount of resources, and they are recruited, and they're often, at least at private institution, full payers. And counseling, wellness, spiritual life offices, very helpful for refugee students to connect. Educational opportunity programs, exceptionally helpful. Here at SUNY Albany, for example, I made some great connections with educational opportunity structures because they're also bringing in, because it's focused on resources and economic marginalization, as well as preparedness, academic preparedness. Those programs have really been helpful. So you see there's a group of colleges involved here, 2-year, 4-year, private, public. Okay, so let me see. Oh, now it's not working. Oh, there it is. Okay, aggregated findings I'm going to talk about first. Very quick. I find that we have a lot of issues to worry about when we talk about students with immigration backgrounds in general. We know if you're not well resourced, if your parents didn't go to college, if your language skills are in the home are a challenge for you to attend college, you have barriers. But if you're of migration background because you have been expelled from your country, or you have been attacked, or whatever might have been happening to you, and you have trauma, that is multi-layered, and that compounds all of these issues. So we have 4 categories here that I want to quickly mention. These are collapsed, from the interviews, collapsed barriers. Category 1, informational barriers. You probably all know it's very difficult. You go into a website of a university and you click 16 times and you're trying to find something on how much it's going to cost, and you can't figure it out, and it still doesn't seem clear, and FAFSA you've never heard of, and all of that. Done. Very, very difficult to figure out, right? Word of mouth is often used, and that's why we have introduced in the Albany area workshops in community, because then we can overcome misinformation that is shared through word of mouth. Thank you. Word of mouth is where you are where community members talk about, well, Siena College, very difficult to get money out of them because, whatever it is, right? And so we go in and say, actually, no, you have to do this and this, and then and so you overcome maybe a private institution's reputation, or you understand that maybe it's not so scary to be in a classroom like it's at SUNY Albany that is a little larger in the beginning. It's okay, as long as you understand that there are opportunities for you. Category 2, procedural barriers, credentials and entry testing. I want to give you a quick example. Afghans that have come to this, sorry, I don't know what I'm doing here. Afghans that are coming here, sometimes when they have prior education, they have to pay the Taliban between $1,000 and $5,000 to get their credentials out of the country, because the universities in Afghanistan were taken over by the Taliban. The administration there is no longer the same administration. The prior people that taught there either left the country, have been arrested, or whatever happened to them. So when you left the country, you had no records with you. Maybe you had a piece of paper, but that's not officially certified. Huge problem for people. They cannot transfer their credits to this country. And that's just one example, entry testing, they're good maybe linguistically, but not in written form, is maybe harder. Those are the kinds of barriers that adults often experience. Category 3, situational barriers, resources. We're all well aware that resources are a huge barrier. Gender-based expectation. Let me tell you, it is men, young men, that have the hardest time making it through college, because they are thinking themselves that they are required to get a job to support their families. If they're resource poor, a lot of young men will say, fine, I'll go some other time to college. I'll get my education later. I need to get a job now. I need to get paid. I don't know, I didn't touch it. So, and then environmental barriers. And here we can look at family expectation. We, for example, tell our students with a refugee background or migration background, when you have class, do not go home in the middle of the day and come back. Stay all day on campus. Do all your work on campus, because when you go home, you might be asked to take your parents for a doctor's appointment. You might have to interpret something. You might have to do other work. So we try to encourage, if they have 3 days of classes, to spend all 3 days in the classroom, in the library, and do their work and do all their work that they can do at that time. And then, and the other days they can try and help their families. So there are these sort of environmental pressures, I call them, you know, competing priorities, time expectations. We tell our students, consider going to college like a job for 3 days of the week. Okay, so last slide, which is okay. What's that? Yep, here we go. Best practices. Okay, so my colleagues and I working on this, we're trying to come up with a manual of best practices for college campuses to sort of think about what we can do. And so 3 observations here very quickly. We find it exceptionally important to build trust with community members. It's not good enough for admissions people to just go out and chat at a high school and say, yep, done. Not going to work, not going to bring in students. There's no trust. We work through and with nonprofits that are involved in the refugee communities locally. So we have that connection. We also have, like my colleague Nana from Russell Sage, she runs the Intercultural Cafe where people come. We have the special tutoring outreach service for that some of our students run with Burmese. We also have community engaged courses where we spend 8 weeks in the summer working with refugee communities. Secondly, financial literacy. I think it's incredibly important to explain to students how loans work, what it means to go to college, if it's an investment, how to write an appeal, those kinds of things, right? And to talk to them about academic expectations. Time is over. I'm going to say last sentence and then I'll be right on time. Systems levels thinking is essential. We often rely on 1 or 2 people on a campus or 1 office to deal with all of these issues. And that's just simply unfair to the students and also unfair to the staff. So thank you very much. I hope it was of interest to some of you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vera. I think that, for the interest of time, let's take the questions at the end. Write down your questions. And I know this will be a very engaging conversation because there's a lot of material to digest from these presentations. Coming up next, we have the role of higher education institutions in providing education and support to refugees and immigrants by Sveta Dobreva. All the presentations are
I just need a minute to get to my notes. Oops. Well, hi everyone. I'm really glad I can share a little bit about the work I did as a fellow of the Institute on Immigrant Integration last summer. And just a little bit about myself. I came to the US as an international student almost 10 years ago. And so I was able to benefit from a lot of resources. I received a full-time scholarship, a tuition waiver, and an additional scholarship. And also I was able to benefit from accessing an office dedicated to international students on campus, which was really helpful in my successful just navigation of a US academic institution, especially in the first year or two of being in the country. And what my research is about, and I'm going to share a little bit with you today, is that a lot of universities don't yet have the same amount of support for refugee and undocumented students. And I really hope and wish that with some policy changes, the same amount of resources that benefit international students like myself can benefit undocumented and refugee students as well. So, so again, I did this work as a fellow for the Institute on Immigrant Integration at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. And the goal of my research was to understand what sort of higher education programs exist to serve immigrants and refugees, and to make some policy recommendations for how they can be improved or strengthened. I have no idea why this is happening, but I'm going to talk about some findings from both my literature review and interviews with university faculty and administrators from universities, both in New York State and across in the country, specifically on the opportunities and barriers that immigrant background students experience. So now I finally transition to my second slide. So my research question for the entire project has been, what is the role of higher education institutions in providing education, wraparound services, and support to immigrants, refugees, and undocumented students? So first, I would like to just briefly talk about why supporting these populations' access to college education and professional jobs matters. So if you look at the chart on the left, currently almost 1/3 of all higher education students in the US are immigrants or children of immigrants. It's also important to know that their share of the student population is rapidly increasing from 1/5 of all students 20 years ago to 1/3 today. And in a few states, if you look on the chart to the right, you can see that the share of students of immigrant background in New York State is even higher, where they make up almost half of all higher education students. One population of students that policymakers should really give attention to is undocumented students, who currently represent almost 2% of the total student body across the US. Their share of the total enrollment in college is half of what it was just a few years ago, which raises questions about the barriers this specific student subpopulation faces in accessing education. And lastly, another subgroup I considered in my research is refugees. There aren't many specific statistics available about refugee students and their access to higher education. But what I found is that about 6% of refugees worldwide access higher education. This is up from 3% in 2020. So at least globally, this trend is in the right direction, but clearly the numbers are still very low. So when doing the literature review for this project, a very common theme was the barriers that immigrants, refugees, and undocumented students face in accessing higher education. A number of the barriers they face came up again and again in the literature, with the most common one being financial need. It's a barrier to accessing higher education, but also to remaining a student, as Professor Ikarius Kelly already mentioned. And this might be obvious considering the fact that first-generation immigrants generally are working to establish themselves economically in the US. And also we know the cost of higher education is very high in the US. So this point also connects with the point about family obligations and the need to work. If financial need is an issue, but students are able to enroll, they may need to work and juggle a job and classes. Also, many students may need to work to help support their families. Another barrier is mental health. Many students of immigrant background may have experienced trauma. We can consider the experience of refugees as well as undocumented students who may have mental health needs due to their precarious status, identity conflicts, and a larger political climate that may be anti-immigrant. Language is another area that may limit access to education, in particular for newcomers. If students are new to the country and language, they are also often new to the academic culture of higher education in the US, which can further add to their challenges. And the last barrier I'm going to mention, which didn't come up in the literature review I did, but it came up quite often in my conversations with university representatives, was the potential lack of information about access to higher education. Immigrants or children of immigrants and their families may not really have the knowledge about how to access higher education in the US, about how to apply and get to college, how to access scholarships, or even to know that there are scholarships available to them. So without this information, potential students may not even attempt or consider pursuing higher education. And so on the other side of the slide, higher education institutions also face barriers in supporting these students. University staff and faculty often lack awareness about the challenges these students face, and they often need more information about how to best support these student subpopulations. Other major barriers may include lack of support from leadership, not having adequate funding, and dealing with limiting state and federal policies. So based on the literature and current university and state practices and policies, I identified the continuum of higher education programs supporting immigrant background students. So at one end of the continuum, to the left of the slide, is the access and right to education approach. At the other end is the holistic approach. Any of these approaches, either of these approaches, could include programs at a single institution, a larger organization working with multiple institutions, or government policies. So under the access and right to education approach, the major goal is making it possible for immigrants and refugees to enroll in college or other educational programs. Some examples of this approach include in-state tuition policies for undocumented students or scholarships to make it more possible for students to enroll. University programs and government policies in this approach don't typically include support beyond access to scholarships and tuition waivers, so they don't offer non-academic needs such as food or housing insecurity, legal, social, or career counseling support. On the other end of the spectrum is the holistic approach, in which universities support immigrants and refugees beyond enrollment. Such programs offer non-academic support to cover basic needs such as food or housing insecurity, legal and career counseling, and social and mental health support. The focus in this approach is on supporting students throughout their entire academic path until graduation. The institutions practicing the holistic approach recognize that many of the barriers immigrant students face on the path to graduation aren't necessarily academic ones. Some examples of this approach include organizations that work to support newly arrived refugee students on campuses, such as World University Services Canada, and the CUNY Undocumented and Immigrant Student Programs, which you will hear about firsthand in a few minutes. And they are another example of a best practice for a service that supports enrolled undocumented students in a holistic way. So just a few last words about the policy approaches. Taking a look at this continuum, I found in my research that university or state programs and policies that fall under the holistic approach offer the strongest support for students and make the biggest impact on their academic and professional development. That being said, programs and policies falling under the other approach, the access and the right to education approach, are definitely a great initial step in supporting immigrant background students, but they really should be thought of as an initial step. Offering holistic support has the highest impact in the long term. So there is a lot of information here. I found that there are multiple policies that can help remove or mitigate some of the barriers that students and practitioners face. So on the institutional level, there should be increased training and advocacy to increase awareness among administration, faculty, and staff. There should be more tailored services for each individual subgroup, so there should be more dedicated spaces on college campuses, specifically assisting undocumented students, refugee students, and so on and so forth. There should be an increased flexibility in academic and non-academic policies and programs, and there should be more cooperation and standardization across institutions, so especially institutions which are just beginning to offer some services to some of these student subgroups should be able to more easily find each other, collaborate with each other, and make the transition to offering such services smoother. So moving on to the state level. The state level is really where the vast majority of university faculty and administration I at least spoke to thought change was both within reach, as opposed to at the federal level, and also that at the state level it would make the most impact as opposed to at the institutional level. So that's why the vast majority of my policy recommendations are at the state level. So at the state level, there are some policy recommendations that apply to all subgroups of students. For example, the first one, funding non-academic support, such as in cases of food and housing insecurity, as well as covering legal fees for students, would greatly benefit refugee and undocumented students, as well as any low-income immigrant background students. But there are also some recommendations that are specific to specific subgroups. For example, the third bullet point, extending in-state tuition and state aid to undocumented students in all states, as well as making in-state tuition and state aid dependent on residency rather than education. I will, for the sake of time, I will transition to the federal level policies. So at the federal level, I have a few recommendations. One is to increase funding for multilingual hotlines for FAFSA, because currently the availability of such multilingual hotlines varies quite a bit from state to state, but also from language to language. So that creates very uneven access for immigrant families and immigrant background students who need assistance in order to navigate the FAFSA application. Also, simplifying the language in FAFSA would help because, and that's maybe an even bigger issue, that the FAFSA language is very bureaucratic, which makes it unnecessarily confusing and complicated. And what a few university representatives emphasized was that even with a translator to assist you, it can still be very difficult, a very difficult application to navigate. And despite multiple changes and updates to FAFSA, as I'm sure you know very well about, its language itself has not really become much more accessible to students and people generally. So if there could be a change on the federal level to remove some of that bureaucratic layer of language in FAFSA, it would make the process a lot more accessible to a much larger range of people. I'm not sure if I have 1 minute for concluding thoughts. So immigrants and refugees face many challenges in accessing and completing higher education. Some institutions and states are already increasing their support, but there is much more that can and should be done to support immigrants, refugees, and undocumented students to fully develop their potential in achieving their educational and professional aspirations. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists.
you so much. Thank you so much, Sveta. And I'm so glad to see one of our fellows presenting today. This is a dream come true. One thing we wanted to have included in the proposal for this institute was to give the opportunity to fellows to do more work, and for that work to live here within the institute and connecting the research that students are doing at SUNY and also at CUNY. That was very, very important for us. I would like to now invite Cynthia Nayeli Carvajal. She will talk about examining in-state tuition, state aid, and certification policies for undocumented and immigrants in New York. I think you will know how to use these.
Yeah, I think I'll just use the,
Yeah, you can
this here. Yeah.
whatever you prefer.
Okay, thank you. Okay, hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia Carvajal. I work at the City University of New York in the central office under the title of Director of Undocumented Immigrant Student Programs. This is a new office within the CUNY system. There isn't a SUNY counterpart, which is what also makes this a little difficult in collaboration with SUNY entities. I also wanted to kind of similarly that how Savata shared, I wanted to share that I am also an immigrant to this country. I came on a tourist visa. It expired, and then I was undocumented all throughout my K-12 education. I was able to adjust my status by luck and happenstance. And so I want to emphasize that often our students who are undocumented do not have a pathway to citizenship. It's very much by luck if anything kind of comes out of that. But I'm going to talk about the intersection of education and immigration as it relates to 3 legislations in New York, 2 of which are already in existence, and one of which Catalina Cruz talked about in the session earlier today, but I want to make sure to also touch upon it. So the research topic is really utilizing a comparative literature review that was partially inspired by my dissertation, but also inspired by whenever I provide workshops and conversations at university systems, folks often assume that New York is light years ahead of the country in the same way that California is. Both in New York and outside of New York, people make that assumption. And so how does New York rank amongst its counterparts in terms of immigrant-friendly legislation at the intersection of educational mobility? And considering current and upcoming policies, how does New York hinder the economic and social integration of immigrant and undocumented individuals? And this is where those 3 legislations are going to be key. So before I jump into state legislation, I do want to acknowledge that federal legislation has an impact on how folks are able to access resources at the state level. So the 3 main legislations here are Plyler v. Doe, Supreme Court case that provided access to equitable K-12 education for anyone, regardless of immigration status. And that's why if someone's undocumented, they can attend a public high school. Post 9/11 regulations that came out of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, so specifically Section 505. This legislation mandated whether public universities could provide in-state tuition to individuals who were not U.S. citizens or permanent residents. Then the Student Adjustment Act of 2001 helped to remove some of that. And so then that's how states were able to provide in-state tuition and state aid to undocumented individuals. And all of this really comes down, you don't need to memorize any of this federal legislation. All of it comes down to state sovereignty, which is a part of what Catalina was mentioning of it being constitutionally adjacent. So states have the right to delegate legislation in their states that the federal government has not exclusively and explicitly stated is their responsibility. And so this is where in-state tuition, state aid, certification, and licensings are left up to the states. So to give you kind of a brief overview of New York legislation as it relates to immigrants at the intersection of education and immigration, you can't really see what's bolded here, but what I'll highlight is 1989 is when the mayor issued an executive order that provided in-state tuition to individuals who are undocumented. It was the first state to do so. But then when 9/11 occurred, it was promptly removed by CUNY. CUNY senior administrators cited federal legislation, specifically Section 505 that I referenced previously, to remove in-state tuition. Public spaces, nonprofit organizations began advocating for the return of in-state tuition. It was returned in 2002. It was supported and restored by the governor at the time. But between 2002 and 2019, there was really nothing else happening in New York State as it relates to immigrant support for their educational mobility. The only things worth noting is that PRUCOL was codified in healthcare, meaning if someone was a PRUCOL status, I'm not sure if folks are familiar with that term, but permanently residing under color of law, it's basically anyone who has an employment authorization document, DACA, TPS, refugee, asylum pending, they could access healthcare. DACA being considered PRUCOL, even if it's removed, also occurred. Access to taking the bar exam if you're undocumented was also provided during this time frame. But short of that, there was nothing happening in New York as it relates to supporting immigrants and undocumented students at the intersection of education and immigration. Then in 2019, the New York State DREAM Act passed. And so that was 10 years of advocacy before the governor signed it. Along with the Green Light Project, they passed roughly the same amount of time or the same time frame. And now in 2024, access to emergency Medicaid to undocumented individuals over the age of 65. So this is just a breakdown to give you a sense of how little legislation exists for undocumented and immigrant folks in New York State in particular. And so how does it compare to other states? So consistently, Texas, California, Florida, and New York are the top 3 to 4 states as it relates to the population of undocumented individuals in higher education, undocumented individuals in each state, and first and second generation immigrants in the state. I'm trying to figure out if I can move this so you all can see. Maybe that will disappear at some point. But you'll see these are the top 4 states that are consistently have the highest population for this group. And so what does it look like? How do those 4 states compare as it relates to in-state tuition and state aid? So this is a national overview of what is the kind of legislation that all the states across the country have as it relates to in-state tuition and state aid. Comprehensive, they provide both in-state tuition and state aid to undocumented students. So you see a good chunk of those states are located there. Accessible, they provide one or the other. Typically it's in-state, but they don't provide state aid. And then limited, the other ones are a bit more categorized. But I want to emphasize that California, Texas, and New York are listed under comprehensive, while Florida is listed under accessible. And just as kind of a little side note, Texas was actually the first state to provide both in-state tuition and state aid for undocumented folks. So again, New York did not have that until 2019. Texas provided it in 2001. And so breaking down even more, what does this look like for the 4 states that I'm referring to? So Texas has in-state tuition. As I mentioned, you have to have graduated a public or private high school, have attended for 3 years in order for you to receive in-state tuition. New York, something similar, except for 2 years. And you have to also apply within 5 years of receiving that diploma or GED equivalent in order to get in-state tuition. For Florida, similar to Texas, 3 years, but you have to apply to go to college within 24 months of graduating high school or getting the GED. You'll see California is empty. And that's because California has several in-state tuition legislations. And so I'm not going to read all of them, but essentially in California, if you attended a high school, an adult school, a community college for at least 3 years or the equivalency, or you attained a GED and fulfill minimum transfer requirements, you can get in-state tuition. And so many of our students in New York aren't able to access in-state tuition because it's not as expansive as California's. And California has had 4 legislations that have done that, and they've passed it from 2001, 14, 17, and 2022. And so the barriers that our students are facing is that students who graduate that are undocumented, who graduate with less than 2 years of high school in the state of New York and do not have a high school GED or, a New York State GED or equivalency, will never be able to access in-state tuition. And adult learners with foreign diplomas who are undocumented are discouraged from getting a GED because it's considered kind of a double degree. You have the high school foreign diploma and the GED, and they are also not able to qualify for in-state tuition. And so a good portion of the folks that we work with, the community members that we're a part of, won't be able to access in-state tuition. The solution to this is what California has done. They have expanded access to in-state tuition by passing legislation every time that they see an issue happening in their communities. As it relates to state aid, you'll see the breakdown here again. Florida, we'll quickly get out of the way. There is no state aid in Florida, unfortunately. I know a lot of folks are advocating for it right now. For both Texas and New York, the eligibility criteria is roughly the same. You have to have attended high school or gotten a GED in the state. You have to have lived there for a certain amount of years, and you have to apply within a certain time frame. But again, for California, they've expanded access to state aid through several years. So twice in 2011 and again in 2024. And so as a result, if you qualify for in-state tuition, you can also get access to Cal grants, UC grants, state university grants, the College Promise Grant, EOP programs, which is for New York, you only have access to HESC administered aid, which is TAP, Excelsior, and Opportunity programs. And so the barriers that our students are facing is general access due to the eligibility requirements. So same as in-state tuition, if you don't have those education criteria, the amounts of awards that are provided, which are limited at both the undergraduate level and especially at the graduate level. And so the solution is updated legislation to expand access to more financial aid pots of funds and tools for universities and the state to better understand. And so what do I mean by tools? Again, not to continue to bring California into this, but California has annual data reports that they share, and it's completely public for anyone to see, that highlights how many folks are getting state aid in the state of California through the California Dream Act, through FAFSA. They break it down by education level, by award amount, by average of like their income, GPA, family size. New York does not have that, and it's been 5 years now since the New York State Dream Act has been in effect. And so with no current data sets, my office conducted a brief study led by one of our interns where we interviewed 100 students or surveyed 100 students. The average income is $40,000, while the average award is $2,200. The cost of attendance at a 4-year campus at CUNY is $6,930, not including fees. So it does not meet the need that students needed to meet. With regards to occupational licensing and certification, and so now I'm breezing through it, but for licensing and certification, another legislation, it does not exist in the state of New York. You'll see that the only comparative states that are listed under comprehensive access are California and New Jersey. But New York has limited accessibility, meaning that they can only provide it if you have an employment authorization document like DACA or TPS. And so currently in New York, if you are undocumented, you cannot get licensed to be a teacher, to be a nurse, to be a social worker, unless you go to Jersey and get the license there. And that means you also have to practice in Jersey. And so the Empire State Licensing Act, which again, Catalina Cruz noted, would resolve this issue just as other states have. Crucial individuals, like I said, are able to get licensed and certification, but if you're undocumented, you cannot. This is creating a brain drain in New York where folks are leaving to other states because this state is not supportive enough. And so, as I've kind of hounded here, is that despite the perception and self-perception of an immigrant-friendly and progressive state, New York falls behind several comparative states as it relates to policies, investment in existing efforts, and updates to current legislation to support recently arrived immigrants. And so my policy recommendations is to update in-state tuition and state eligibilities, create data reporting tools for the New York State Dream Act, provide clear and explicit guidance on access to state funds for universities because they often are still following the Section 505 of IRA, and supporting immigrant-friendly legislation like the Empire State Licensing Act. And that's it. Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, California is always leading the way. I was surprised to see some of that information you shared about Texas. That was good. Yeah. Okay, now to talk about accessing quality education, local and global perspectives from refugees, Caroline. Thank you.
All right. I'm glad that my colleagues Vera and Svetla went first because they provide a lot of good federal context and honestly a lot of the similar findings too. So that's good to hear. It's a pleasure to be here today. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I am also a native New Yorker, so I could not think of a better opportunity to present the research that the Refugee Educational Advancement Lab did down in the DMV, no, not the Department of Motor Vehicles, the DC, Maryland, Virginia metropolitan area. So I am out of state now. I feel like an outsider. But thank you for allowing me to present this research, and without further ado, accessing quality education. So a little bit about me and my background is I am a scholar practitioner. Currently, I am more focused in the data side as a monitoring and evaluation specialist. And currently, I'm working 2 part-time jobs, one at MapWorks Learning as their M&E specialist and the other as a consultant with ISIP Study Abroad. maintaining the refugee work with MapWorks Learning right now, doing exchange programs with Ukrainian refugees and Palestinian students as well. I recently completed my master's education in education and human development at George Washington University, where I did this research with the Refugee Educational Advancement Lab, completed my BA at Harvard in anthropology, and these are some of my identities that inform my reality, my research, my positionality. So that is really all I have to say about that. An overview of what I'm going to discuss today. So I will go over our study, to mainly our research design and methodology, and explaining how it is replicable. That was really, for us as the lab, the big takeaway is that this can be replicated by academics, by practitioners, and it does allow a lot of good information to be generated. In the second part, I will adapt this to the New York context, and then I surmise some possible outcomes that might come out of this. So part one, of course, the disclaimer, these views are my own, not that of George Washington University, not that of REAL, and not that of any of my employers. So this is our book. This idea was conceived back when we had formed the lab in September of 2021. We were really deciding our mission, what we wanted to do. Let's see if I can get rid of this. What we wanted to do, what we wanted to stand for as the Refugee Educational Advancement Lab. Disable annotation. No. Oh, hide. Yeah. Where was I? Oh, yes. And we wanted to make our work meaningful in that it uplifted the voices of those that we wanted to serve. So refugees, migrants, and everyone trying to access educational equality. So through that, we created this study. It wound up being an IRB study, so we had to go through several rounds of edits. But we, again, did want to create that tangible, replicable study for documenting the realities of refugees in the DMV, triangulating data from this qualitative applied research. And ultimately, we hope that whether through our scholars or anyone who does read the book, especially those policymakers, that they take these findings and then take that to the next level as action research. So this is the framework that we used. Basically, we wanted to learn about the refugee perspectives. We focused in the DMV, and to triangulate that data, we looked at the services available in the DMV. We used purposive and a snowball sampling to gather our participants for the research. And then we sought to elicit the barriers to education access that these individuals were exhibiting. They were part parents, siblings taking care of younger siblings, some children that we did have to get special permission to interview, and also academic experts and practitioners in the field as well. And then finally, again, we wanted to get recommendations out of this so that it can be brought to that next step. And this is basically our table of context, but I included these in the slides just so that you can see exactly how many different sectors or how many different topics this can touch potentially. So section 1 focuses on access, where it covers the education policies through a policy analysis for refugees in the US. We discuss some barriers that refugees face when they are trying to access it in the US. And then we go into specific research insights at each education level, beginning with tertiary and career and technical education, CTE, in the DMV, which was my chapter. And then globally, that is known as TVET. So it is important to contextualize all of that information. Section 2 then focuses on inclusion. It moves into early childhood education and through the K through 12 education systems. And then it moves into discussing asset-based approaches to overcome language barriers in educational settings. We find that too often it is focused on the deficit approaches. So we really want to take what knowledge that refugees bring to the table and uplift that so that it is centered and we can actually build off of that within our own education systems. And of course, recommendations for educational support infrastructure. And finally, section 3 discusses how the research insights contribute to recommendations for how to apply these findings through capacity building and enrollment and inclusive practices, information and knowledge sharing across the different sectors and stakeholders who work with refugees. And I cannot stress this enough, knowledge sharing, information sharing across sectors, because as we will see, there were some pretty big findings that we found, and how there were too many chefs in the kitchen. Everything was getting lost in the sauce. So as you can see, our research questions covered a wide range of topics that we took to holistically examine refugee educational realities. Okay, moving on to the methodology, which is my domain now. For this qualitative applied research, we started it off with desk research because this was an IRB study. We had to make sure that we did everything we could in our power to make sure we didn't harm the community that we most sought to serve, and that we could give something back to them as well. So at the end, they also did receive copies of our book chapters that either pertain to them, or if they wanted to receive the book, we are working on getting the funding as well to distribute those. And then once we did have that IRB approval, we had to previously submit all these survey questions similar to Vera's as well, but more broadly covering their educational experiences. We did outreach to refugee and expert communities. We worked a lot with the resettlement agencies in order to gain access to a lot of the refugees that we did wind up interviewing. We did also interview anyone in the DMV who was currently doing research on it as well, up to and including our faculty advisor, Bernard Streitfieser. And then we conducted the interviews, transcribed and anonymized them to protect their identity, and because obviously sensitive situations that were still going on at the time. We had Afghan refugees, we had Venezuelan refugees in the DMV, and we really wanted to protect their identities. And then we coded that information and analyzed the data through thematic analysis. This was our theoretical framework. We centered it around the decolonial perspective, which for those of you who are more practitioners than people in academia, the decolonial perspective basically just means it's not decolonizing, but it's conducting research, investigating and examining, questioning how there are still colonial perspectives and aspects within our legal systems, within our education systems, and how we can eradicate those, and again, centering the refugee voices. At the next level, oh, that's disappointing, they were arced previously. At the second level, there was intersectionality, refugee voice, critical race theory, and ultimately the themes that were elicited, thank you, the themes that were elicited, access, inclusion, and application. Since I do only have 5 minutes, that's so fast. Next up, there was our findings. We found that under the 3 themes that we chose to frame our findings around access, inclusion, and application, a lot of what we saw before, financial barriers, legal barriers, frequent policy changes depending on the presidency, depending on budget. Under inclusion, we found there was a lack of community and school support, potentially some attitudes as well, as you can imagine. And then cultural and language differences created a barrier. The mental health and trauma made the relatability difficult, and they really needed more resources in that domain, and it was often neglected. And then finally, again, information sharing and dissemination, the information was not reaching who it needed to be reaching. And then there was a lack of communication and coordination between stakeholders, and there was a greater need for alternative education pathways and complementary services. So now moving into part 2, and I'm going to have to rush this part. So the purpose of why I'm presenting it at this conference, I'm seeing a lot of my colleagues did do a lot of overlap with the immigrant and refugee population. They are legally distinct, which most of you know. So once you adapt that kind of the study, it is replicable, but it is important to tailor it to the specific context with which we are working, which mainly immigrant and or refugee, depending on your study, and DMV versus New York. And those research questions have to be tailored. But here's a sample research question. You'll notice it looks very familiar. What are the experiences? Oh no. of immigrants who arrived in New York State in the last X years in terms of access to educational services. Some of the purposes that we had, why uplift the voices of immigrants and their experiences in education. It's a research tool to fill in the gaps in academic literature. Do we want to bridge that scholar-practitioner divide, empowering both the scholar and also the people who are at the center really working with the individuals that we're tailoring our programs to? Do we seek to positively influence the development of future programs? Again, are we doing asset-based approaches? And do we want to see more of that, like translanguaging, which is something that one of the CUNY schools is doing? Do we want to enrich the experiences of all education students through navigating critical conversations? Yes, we do. We do want to do that. And we want to build that global competence because overall, this education, everyone said it in the welcoming remarks, education does create those access to opportunities. It does empower the self, and anyone coming to New York, to the US, wants to have those opportunities and deserves to have those opportunities. So again, same sample methodology that we did earlier. Something I would like to also see in future iterations, however possible, is to include some quantitative data to supplement. I'm a mixed methods gal through and through, so this was purely qualitative, which I do think is absolutely valid, and more of it needs to be integrated into academia. But quantitative statistics, however you choose to frame it, would also be good to supplement that as well, as we are data-driven. And then finally, moving into those emergent themes and implications, some potential takeaways from the study. There could be duplicate efforts by different departments. That's something that I found very frequently in career and technical education, hence why there was a lack of communication and people didn't know where to go. Economic and legal constraints. Someone mentioned, I forget now who, students were tempted to drop out of high school because they felt that they had a responsibility to contribute financially to the family, or they would delay their tertiary education, whatever that might be, in order to maintain working. Or perhaps they even are already adults and they don't even want to attend the bilingual classes because they're, trying to support an entire family to come here. Communities are unaware of those services available. I'm a first-generation Polish American. FAFSA was murder, and even throughout college, I was still discovering all of the Bureau of City Council resources and all of the mental health services that, in certain communities were stigmatized, but these are resources available to everyone. And I really wish in hindsight that somebody had told me, or that it was very obvious to find. And then I mentioned adult classes and children, so we covered that. And then some sample recommendations that might be elicited. This is the program that I was talking about, translanguaging in bilingual classrooms. Translanguaging basically is, in a nutshell, Spanglish, using all of the tools and resources that bilingual, multilingual students, refugees, immigrants have at their disposal to communicate, including actions and dance and song. Whatever is central to their culture. Increase academic funding for action research, encouraging student autoethnographies, teacher training and support, always teacher training and support, triangulating data on education programs and wraparound services, information sharing regularly into the communities, and working with religious organizations, all those public-private partnerships, cross-sectoral efforts. For example, one of the biggest problems we ran into is that people from the resettlement agencies were struggling to meet once the refugees were resettled into their communities, because that refugee family did not own a car. So they didn't know how to navigate the public transportation system. They didn't know, they didn't have to drive 2 hours, and virtual issues were also very prominent. And then adjustment of language assessments and requirements, increased mentorship and counselor training. And again, I mentioned those public-private partnerships. And then just a personal note of thanks. My dad is here today with us in the audience, and he is one of the immigrants that, him and my mom came over here and really started the life for us. And it has absolutely shaped my reality. And I'm so grateful for everything that you two have done for me. And that is all that I have to say. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Caroline. That was phenomenal. Now, we do have 2 more presentations, and I'm wondering, we have only one person presenting for those, or are you all, the team is coming up? Okay, okay. So we have CUNY Initiative on Immigration and in Education, the CUNY IIE, Tamara Alsace, Cecilia Espinosa, and Tatiana Klein, as well as Farah Say. Okay, take it over. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Yes, it's afternoon. Good chilly afternoon to everyone. I'm going to set my timer for 5 minutes so we can make sure all of my colleagues get to go. Unfortunately, Cecilia Espinosa is not here with us, but we are here today talking about learning, action, and advocacy from the CUNY Initiative on Immigration and Education, which we refer to as CUNY I. So let me jump right in. I'm Tatiana. Farah Saeed will follow me, and then Tamara Alsace will go next. We all wear many hats, but for right now, we are wearing the hat of CUNY I, and I'm going to jump in. Our work today that we're going to be sharing is a little bit different than the research that you've been seeing, but more of the application. The application and the resources that come from the gaps in the research and in the field of not only higher education, but pre-K to 12 and actually professional work as well. So at CUNY I, we learn about current immigration issues, act in ways that center our collective humanity, and advocate for equitable immigration policies for people regardless of immigration status. I should say we're also funded by the New York State Education Department, which, you know, New York State is not always on top for everything, as Cynthia showed us, but at least the state is investing in this type of work. Cynthia Carvajal was actually our founding project director and authored these grounding principles, which when you do immigration work, it's very important for people to know where you're coming from. So I will just read them briefly to you because I think they're important to be said out loud. Black immigrant lives matter. The immigrant experience is complicated. No one should move my slides. No one is illegal on stolen land. Migration can be traumatic. We are not all immigrants. Xenophobia is systemic. The immigration experience exists beyond the Latinx narrative. Teaching through translanguaging is central. Immigrants and students labeled as English language learners are not interchangeable. And we must shift from ally to accomplice. We have, I was going to give you a minute to pick a grounding principle and reflect on it, read a little bit more, but what I will do instead is tell you that on our website, we have these in multiple languages. We found these very useful for educators to discuss, but also for students to discuss as well. And so you can see them there. I also want to share a few other resources we have on our website before my colleagues dig in a little bit to the work that we've done with undocumented educators or aspiring undocumented educators and the policy implications that have come out of our work. On our website, we have, first we had a video series called Supporting Immigrants in Schools, which were 4 videos. And then what we did was we realized this was not enough, right? This is a battle here. We have modules on key immigration issues, refugee and immigrants, which was actually done in Buffalo, the video at least for it, and then immigration in elementary and secondary schools, because those realities are very different. Recently, we've added 2 new modules to our work. One is trauma-informed practice, because we know that teachers are definitely not psychologists or counselors, but their students come with trauma in their classroom and they have to have some supports in terms of how to support their students and also support the teachers, right, who are dealing with students from such varied experiences. We've also created a module on translanguaging for multilingual immigrant students, where students bring in their full linguistic repertoire, different languages, varieties of languages, and are free and encouraged to use those for their learning and as a resource. We also just released a video series called Not Too Young: Immigration in Elementary Schools. We find that in high school, there are more spaces to discuss immigration, but we know that the littlest students and their families can also discuss this. What you see, the guide is how to welcome a new student, a guide, this is the coolest part, for teachers created by students, by third graders, about what teachers should be doing to support immigrant students and to welcome them. We have in the Children's School of Rochester, a family literacy program where parents and families are sharing about the education system in the countries they came from, so schools understand the differences. And also in the Bronx, we have a school that collaborated with the Tenement Museum in New York City, a project called My Story, Our Story, where families brought in artifacts, but it was not in kind of these like artificial ways, but really each artifact really gave room to a lot of depth and history and cultural connections. It was really a special experience. So all of these are videos that we not only want to tell educators about, but show how this can be done in our elementary schools. We also have a group that collaborated with the New York State Leadership Council that actually led this work many years ago about a framework for oh my gosh, how did that happen? For immigrant liaisons, which was then actually enacted in Greece School District and piloted in New York City schools. And now I will let you know we have an FAQ that's really awesome. So if you're ever, bored and have time, check out our website, and I will pass it to my colleague Farah Saeed.
I'll try. Thank you, Tatiana. Hello, everyone. My name is Farah Saeed. It is my pleasure to be in your presence today. I immigrated from Cairo, Egypt, to the United States at age 15 in 2008. I am undocumented without DACA, and I finished my master's degree in bilingual education from the City College of New York last year. And I'm a project researcher for the UndocuEDU team at CUNY-I. UndocuEDU team is an immigrant-led initiative that uplifts undocumented educators. The team is made up of directly impacted community educators and teachers in New York City. We work together to center the narratives of current and aspiring undocumented educators. My team has focused and continues to highlight the narratives and the experiences of not only undocumented students with DACA, but also the struggles of undocumented students without DACA as myself. In 2021, my team and I created a report, The State of Undocumented Educators in New York, that highlights the experiences of aspiring undocumented educators and the obstacles they face navigating rigid state policies and lack of support and information from educational institutions. Our report is based on research that included interviews and surveys. It describes how undocumented students who currently hold work authorization through DACA have been and continue to be excluded from quality education and specific credentials to become educators. The main goal of the report is to offer recommendations on what can be done to change and address these inequities and to open the path for undocumented educators. Our data revealed systemic push-out of undocumented students from educational institutions, and we have gathered 5 major findings in the report. Undocumented students lack support from educational institutions, which is detrimental as they enter high school and throughout their transition into college. 2, undocumented students experience severe financial strain and physical and mental burnt out, resulting in incomplete or delayed academic journeys. 3, policies that require immigration status and work authorization verification, for example, E-Verify, create obstacles for aspiring undocumented educators from pursuing a career in education. 4, undocumented students cannot afford to complete a semester of unpaid student teaching, which is a requirement for teacher certification and for graduation from teacher certification programs. And lastly, undocumented educators with DACA who successfully enter the education field experience a heightened sense of anxiety and concerns about their ability to maintain their positions or to be promoted due to work permit renewal requirements every 2 years. Based on our participants' suggestions and data analysis, we urge New York State Department of Education and higher education institutions to create educator pipeline programs for all education students, regardless of immigration status, to waive testing fees for all students who demonstrate financial need, to create sustainable solutions to hire educators without work authorization, to include the undocumented experience in the curriculum, particularly in teacher education programs and other fields related to education services. And 5, to provide explicit and transparent information about the requirements and qualifications needed to finish undergraduate programs in education as they pertain to non-citizen students. Our report and findings highlight the challenges of undocumented students and educators, describing their personal experiences as they navigate their own education. We hope that all policymakers and educational institutions will take action to make institutions more equitable for the next generation of all New York State undocumented aspiring educators, especially now that all undocumented students entering high schools and colleges do not qualify for DACA. As our report sheds light on the challenges faced by undocumented students and educators, it is amazing to see tangible progress being made. In September 2022, the New York State Department of Education released an updated policy allowing undocumented students enrolled in education programs to do field work, take certification exams, and student teach in certain schools in New York State. Under this policy, undocumented students who do not have a Social Security number can student teach in charter and private schools. While this updated policy is groundbreaking, allowing undocumented students without a Social Security number as myself to be able to student teach, further policy changes are still needed for undocumented educators to get hired in New York State public schools as teachers. Thank you, and now I'll pass it on to my colleague, Tammy.
Hello, I am Tamara Arsace. Everybody calls me Tammy. I'm from Buffalo, New York, where I was 30 plus years in the Buffalo schools, currently working with CUNY. What on earth happened to this slide? Currently working with CUNY as an associate investigator. And before I dive into this, I do want to say Tatiana gave up some of her time, didn't really introduce herself, but this whole project is her brainchild. We would not be here if it weren't for her vision and her implementation of this amazing 5-year program. So this is really messed up, and I don't know how it happened, but in an attempt to sustain the work beyond the scope of the project, which is in year 5 of a 5-year project, we put a great deal of emphasis this year on policy development and building awareness. And we developed policies in 3 areas: to broaden student teaching and employment opportunities for undocumented educators, enhancing teacher preparation, strengthening in-school support for immigrant students and for the educators who educate them. So in thinking about pathways for undocumented aspiring educators, the focus is on removing barriers to their student teaching and employment as teachers. So we're recommending that the state ensure that undocumented students be provided with opportunities to be placed in all public schools. The fingerprinting change was a great step in the right direction, but we need to be sure that any prohibitive systems that like the PET system used in New York City are removed so that they can be placed in any school for student teaching. And that along with that, I don't know where these slides are even coming from. What's going on here? That once these people graduate and are certified or have a pathway to certification so that they can be employed in New York State schools. I don't know what happened with our slides.
Are those your slides or no?
No, some of them are, but then that is not.
Tamara?
That's me. So this is my slide, and this is my slide, and this is my slide. And I don't know what that is in between there. I don't know where that came from, but it's okay. We'll keep going. Sorry about that. And in the second area, we want to be sure that New York State educators and school leaders have what they need to know about the effects of immigration, current immigration issues, and strategies to meet the needs of immigrant origin students in their schools. And so we are focusing on 2 areas. One is teacher preparation and asking that New York State mandate topics within existing courses for preparing teachers and school leaders and all educators on how best to educate immigrant origin students. And that in-service requirements require that for continued certification, those CTLE credits that are required include a mandate for that a portion of them be set aside for current immigration topics and how to teach immigrant origin students and trauma-informed practices for immigrant origin students. Some of the notes ended up in slides somehow. So New York State teachers need strategies that will help them identify and use trauma-informed practices in their classrooms. We also want to strengthen in-school support for students, and that involves the immigrant liaison position that Tatiana talked about. So we want to mandate that pre-K to 12 schools create an immigrant liaison position, or at least a designee to support immigrant origin students and their families, using a percentage of, for example, Title III immigrant funding that is specifically for immigrant, but they can also use Title I funding, school improvement grant funding, general funding, any way to fund a position such as that. Lastly, we wanted to say that part of our work this year with the policy involved writing some op-eds that were published in the Heckinger Report, Chalkbeat, Albany Times Union, and we want to keep getting the word out. So it's all about educating people with the issues and making sure that the work continues beyond the scope of this project. That's it. Sorry about that.
And make sure you follow the Institute on social media. So to conclude our presentations, we have one more presentation and then a round of questions. Building from strength for asset-based initiatives aimed at helping immigrant communities thrive. Margaret Blacksley, Alberta Conte, Karen Chatfield, and Christine Medellin Paz. So who's going first?
So thank you all so much. Hopefully you're still awake and we need to stand up and stretch. Go ahead while you're listening. No, it's a long day. So we are a group from Bank Street, and you may know of Bank Street or maybe not, but really Bank Street has a history of being proud of having its roots in progressive education. As an institution, we really have been spending the last year with our new dean really reflecting on who we are as an institution and how do our different programs and centers throughout the college actually inform the work that we're doing. And so today you're going to hear different stories from some of our programs that are doing direct program services. And then I will present for myself and my colleague who's not able to be here some of the research that we're doing at Bank Street. But a common theme that we sort of noticed is that all of the work that we're doing as we were kind of sharing our different work together is that it's really focused on centering children, family, teachers, communities at the center, whether it's through our teacher education programs, whether it's how we use research to inform policy, workforce development, and really understanding the social emotional learning of children. So I'm going to let my colleague.
Oh, okay, there is a reason why I'm coming up here with a teddy bear. You will understand. It is helping me feel a little bit better speaking in front of such esteemed colleagues. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here with all of you and with all the folks who we met earlier. I'm the co-director of Emotionally Responsive Practice at Bank Street. And before I share with you the stories and practices of ERP, as we call it, I'm going to ask you to do a little exercise in your mind. It's very quick. Call to mind a memory when you were new somewhere, perhaps in a new community, in a new job. We think it's on a timer. We think that's what's happening. So we just kind of set it back if it goes without us. We've been watching you all, and now we think we figured out the mystery. So I was inviting you to hold in your mind a memory of a time that you were new somewhere. And perhaps you were in a new job, a new community, a new town, a new school, a new country. Maybe this coincides with the time that you were working on learning a new language. Hold the image that came to your mind and ask yourself, what range of emotions do you recall feeling in that new space? I know from my experience of working with many adults that some of those memories will feel pleasant to recall, and some will feel uncomfortable or even unpleasant. Hold on to that memory and those feelings as I speak briefly about the work of emotionally responsive practice at Bank Street and the ways that we as a center have been adapting our approach to support the children of asylum seekers in New York City and immigrant children in general, and always the communities of children they enter into when they arrive in our schools, and the adults who care for them and educate them. The most basic explanation of what ERP, as we call it, does is to provide support for educators and childcare professionals to increase their ability to nurture the mental health and emotional well-being of children, so that those children are able to engage and learn in our schools and childcare centers. We also help educators understand the whys, and I mean the why, the why and the whys behind the emotions and behaviors of the children in our classrooms. We teach that while trauma is real and must be understood, it is not a deficit, and that healing and joy and integration are attainable goals. We offer coaching, which offers thinking partnerships for educators to consider the social emotional needs of their own classes and the individual children in their classes. Our support group model offers a safe space for educators and principals and mental health professionals in schools to reflect on their own stories and their own struggles, and to get advice and support both from the ERP facilitator and from their peers. With what we have been hearing about teacher mental health in these recent years, it's important to note that these spaces for diminishing isolation are crucial to help work against the teacher burnout that so many of you have mentioned today. We also offer parent and family workshops and support groups where family members can connect with each other, share their stories, and get the emotional support that only comes with feeling part of a community. Our approach to this work is not as outside experts, but as partners in making connections. For over a decade, children's own immigration stories have lived in the classrooms and schools that we support. We have taken an active stance in adapting our work so that we include these experiences in how we respond and the resources we offer. In just a few moments, we'll be hearing about some individual children's immigration stories from Alberta. We at ERP have encountered countless immigration stories in our own travels around the city and beyond. If we have time at the end, I'd love to share some of the stories that I have learned and the teachers that I've been able to support in my own journeys as a coach and professional developer. I've been thinking about what the Assemblywoman commented at the beginning of the conference, that we must continue to listen to the voices. And as I've been speaking, I hope you've had a chance to notice the images on the screen behind me. These images are children's drawings, children's dictations, children's stories. These all happen to be stories and writing from children who are immigrants themselves. We believe at ERP that children's stories are their assets. And when their stories are welcome, an integrated community which demonstrates how eager children are to share about their own experience and to have their own stories invited and shared within part of their classroom experiences. With the support of ERP coaching, teachers can invite these stories into their spaces so that no child feels alone. I won't read everything I wrote for the following slides because that probably took a long time. So I'm just going to show the pictures. This is a little bit about how ERP works, sharing books, some of which I brought to share with you today, if you'd like to look afterwards, both to learn from the point of view of a child what an immigration journey may have been like, and to share with children in their classrooms. I was very happy to hear the CUNY folks talking about translanguaging, which we are bringing into our ERP work, and thinking about the emotional experience of languaging, learning language, and learning new languages, and bringing your languages together. And this is exciting. I hope you'll talk to me a little bit afterwards. And the reason I have my bear here is one of our flagship programs is our Teddy Bears in Classroom Practice. And I would be happy to tell people more about that afterwards. This is Alegria. She is my teddy bear. I learned Spanish as a second language. She's learning English as a second language. We help each other. When I make mistakes in Spanish, she's nice to me about it. She makes me feel okay to keep on trying. And I'd just like to conclude with this slide and say, when you look at these photos, which are taken at Alberta's Head Start, and so I thought it was a great segue, look at the relationships and safety that you can see between these children and their teachers and their teddy bears. And I think that images speak 1,000 words. Remember those emotions I asked you to talk about at the beginning? What it feels like to be in a new space? Look at these children and teachers, and you know what an emotionally responsive space looks like, and I think you can feel it too. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Alberta to hear an up-close story of how another branch of Bank Street is meeting the needs of immigrant children and families.
So do I just before this one? Okay. All right. All right. So here's some stories from some of the newly arrived children in our program. As you know, in New York City, we had an influx of newly arrived families coming in, and Head Start is one of the mandates is that we provide educational care to those families regardless of documented status. So these two children, Matthias and Rafaela, are both children who crossed over with their families last year. They started living in shelters and relied on only small donations. Both children saw various instances of violence on their journey here. As a Head Start program, it is a part of the Head Start Act to serve the migrant population. These families do not have to provide any documentation to attend, and we provide them with education as well as assist with resources if needed. Rafaela told us of how she had to leave behind her grandparents' dog and her favorite toy. She also spoke about walking through swamps and seeing alligators. Matthias told us about seeing a gun being pulled out on his brother while his mother tried to cover his eyes. His mother told us that she tried to shield him as much as possible. So these are just a sample of what the children were coming with us and the stories that they're coming with. And it took them a long time to feel comfortable as well because they did not trust anyone when they first arrived. Based on the influx of newly arrived families, we utilized funding from our budget to hire a full-time licensed social worker. In addition to that, we partnered with the Columbia University School of Social Work to obtain interns, one of which was specifically dedicated to assist these families, which amounts to about 7 families. And we have 68 families we serve, so 7 of them were specifically newly arrived families. This social work intern provided social services such as finding them a medical home. Most of them did not have dental care, and they came with various medical emergencies, so we helped them find services in the public hospitals to get that. Obtain an internet service through T-Mobile has a special program where you could get free internet service, and as well as providing them assistance with finding English classes. We also utilized donations from a local church to assist families who needed to move out due to the new rule in the New York City shelters that gave families 60 days and sometimes in instances 30 days to move out. And as Assemblywoman Rivera was saying, a lot of these families found places in Newark, in Staten Island, and they're still traveling that far, and we're in the Lower East Side, so it's about like an hour to 2-hour travel for them. But we also, I didn't put that here, we also provided them with Metro cards through New York City Department of Education, so those families still wanted to come because of the support we gave them. We also provided those families, when they did find housing, beds, household items, plates, bowls, pots, pans, chairs, small dining table. We still wanted them to have that. We don't have much money because it's federally funded, but we really found ways to assist those families because we really wanted them to be supported. The social work interns also conducted individual and group counseling sessions to engage with those students. The teachers also incorporated the concept of ERP, which Margaret greatly described, which she discussed, right, about how to help them deal with the trauma that they were feeling, how to express their emotions, and just generally be able to talk to their friends and not be so afraid. Also, we invested in trainings that would enhance the staff being comfortable with those stories engagement, because not only is it traumatic for the kids, it's very traumatic for the staff because they are the ones who are the first line, right? They're there with them every day and they're hearing those stories. And it was a lot for them to process that a child would feel those traumatic things and see those traumatic things and still be able to be resilient. We had trainings that focused on interacting with families. You know, we had to learn how to interact with those families. They're coming in not trusting anyone. They don't want to repeat their stories. They don't want to be re-traumatized. So really understanding that it's not that they don't want to talk to you, it's that they can't. And we also utilized New York Public Library as well as Bank Street College of Education to help find books that were on topic with newly arrived families, to also help the children in their classes understand them and where they're coming from, because most of them, they do not speak English. So we really wanted to incorporate their culture inside of the classroom as well. And to transition out, because we help them so much, we know that when they do transition into kindergarten, the support that they're going to receive is going to be completely different from having a Head Start program. So we are working with the public schools in the area to ensure that they're in a school that's going to assist them with the same kind of services, if you know, that we can't provide because they have a larger budget. So we really are like working on making those connections within the community to continue providing that, but money is still needed with the federal government to make that a permanent thing and not just on an as-needed basis, because I don't see this concern ending. So we don't want to make it a stopgap where we just do enough for the families in this cycle and then we don't get to continue. So now I will send it to Christina and she'll tell you the research person.
Thank you, Alberta. Okay, so part of my work at Bank Street is that I am a researcher. And so I'm going to share briefly a project that I am doing that's a research practice partnership between Bank Street and the New York Early Childhood Professional Development Institute at CUNY. And really, this work drew out of my previous role as a career advisor there, where I was hearing tons of stories of educators. And I began to really think about how do we create equitable pathways for educators of color, and specifically my focus is on Latina family childcare educators, to really pursue degrees and have upward mobility within the system. And so we know, here's a few stats, that family childcare educators are really, nobody talks about them, although they're gaining momentum right now. They're really at the bottom of the totem pole, but yet they do so much. They wear so many hats, and they're pillars in their communities. We know that often our Latina, Spanish-speaking bilingual educators, they really lack access to culturally relevant professional development and training. And we know that within our higher education systems, yes, we're in an institution, we still privilege English as the language of power. And so if we're really going to kind of think deeply about how do we support our multilingual educators, what are the different innovative approaches that we could really do to move this forward? And when we think about higher ed faculty, and this is just non-tenure track faculty, only 4% are identified as Hispanic females within the higher ed system in the United States. So that's a real problem. And so my work is I have designed a cohort model at a SUNY campus downstate New York. And we are running a credit-bearing child development associate credential. And I'm really looking at, with the support of the Foundation for Child Development as a young scholar, I'm looking at specifically what are the different pieces that need to happen within the SUNY campus to create an equitable experience for a cohort of Latina women. And so this is just a quick story. I'm going to quickly summarize it. So last week was the last week of classes, right? And so I sat in on all of the students' presentations. And Emily is a provider from the Dominican Republic. And she was supposed to get up and do a presentation on what she learned in the classroom. And in this moment, she broke down in tears. She was hysterical. She froze. She could not speak. The professor immediately said, "You don't have to do this. Let's go take a walk." Walked outside with her student to really kind of support her in that moment. And the other students started to hug her and hold the space for her in this college classroom. And so really that quick little illustration, although it can't give you all the wonderful things that I'm noticing, is that what I'm learning through this project is that I'm taking a participatory approach to this research that's a mixed method study. And really through research practice partnerships, we're able to really look closely at how are these different systems really working for this community. And what we're starting to find is having tailored early childhood career advisement in these women's home language is critical. So not the advisement you get on the college campus, but really the advisement that happens through CUNY's program. Having a cohort model builds community and trust. Having specifically for this project, we hired a bilingual bicultural educator so that she could actually lift up the Spanish language in the college classroom. And so you are seeing so much translanguaging happening in that college space between and amongst educators, and really thinking about how do we draw on our educators' wealth as we bring them and center their experiences and their richness into the college classroom. And so this is a working model that I've developed that's really thinking about what does it really mean within higher ed if we are really going to center our students, specifically our immigrant students and our women of color. How do we create these sustaining relationships that are critical? And so really looking at all of the ingredients that go into really doing this, and it's really hard work. And all of this is really through looking at an asset-based lens. I know we are done. I could quickly, my colleague, do I have time to quickly summarize my colleague's work? Okay. Okay, sorry. So Karen Chatfield, she is at Bank Street, and her work is very interesting. It really does look at, she did a study, a really interesting policy study that was at a settlement house, specifically during the American Rescue Plan. And she captured stories from different families that were in the settlement. And specifically, we're asking them about their experiences accessing the expanded child care tax credit. And what she found from this work is that the problem is that many of the immigrant families that she interviewed, more than 600 parents who relied on programs within the settlement house, shared that they really didn't know that these services were for them. And there was so much money left on the table because of lack of information, lack of clarity, and a lot of misconceptions that so many individuals that really could have benefited from this expanded child tax credit did not receive it. And so what Karen's really in her recent report is really talking about that we need to kind of break down, and I think all of you are speaking to this, is how do we kind of take out the jargon so that it's accessible in multiple languages for individuals? And how do we make sure that people are accessing these benefits? How do we provide translation that speaks to the community using their own language and voice? And how do we create open helplines or hold special classes, commercials on TV programs where immigrant parents are likely to watch to learn more about what benefits they can access? And so we thank you. Sorry, we did a speed run through. You can learn more about all of our programs at Bank Street, but we thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. And I do hope that you found these presentations very, informative. We have, I think we can take a few minutes. I think we were supposed to conclude at 4:30, is it? We were supposed to conclude at 4:30. It's 4:28. If you want to stay for a few more minutes, I feel like these conferences are also a great opportunity to just connect with folks that are doing good work. So I do hope that you take a few minutes to just exchange business cards, exchange information so that we can continue the conversation going. And I'm pretty sure also that we will follow up with you on how we can continue to raise these issues and inform the people who make decisions. Hey, here is the research. I did the homework for you. Now you just have to, get it and keep running. But we do have some questions prepared, and I hope that you also, if you have any questions that you feel that you want to ask, please by all means go ahead. But these questions for our panelists actually want to address some of the roadblocks that you have encountered when you are creating programs to benefit refugees and undocumented students. We know that research suggests that new immigrants incur in costs for local governments, especially with respect to schooling and providing health care, as well as other social services. But in the long run, it has been proving, and there is evidence of the positive impact in the local communities and the positive return in the local communities. However, there is a negative narrative, right, to providing services for immigrants. So I would like to ask our panelists today, and you can either come and join us here, or you can answer from where you are. What are some of the challenges that you have encountered in the resistance, and how have you been able to overcome some of that resistance as you create programs to benefit new arrivals? Anyone, feel free to jump in.
My students did a lot of research at Multipurpose, and they in fact found that there is a lot of information available about New York City, but very little about upstate. So we have a real problem going beyond just the headlines of some of the local newspapers in terms of data collection. So looking for years of publications from local newspapers from various cities, from like you look at Buffalo, Rochester, Utah, Syracuse, you find more information about other cities. Albany was lacked data. It was a shocking outcome of this research project. We have no data. And how do you overcome a negative narrative when you have, reports from elsewhere, but locally you can't show the data?
That's very interesting. Anybody has anything to add to that, to the question or anything? Okay, I will move on to the next question. You all discussed policy recommendations to make educational systems more accessible. What are the barriers to the enactment of some of these policies that you have shared? For example, creating a pathway for immigrant undocumented students to become teachers, which sounds like a reasonable policy in light of the teachers shortage that we have. But what are some of the cited objections to such policies? Anyone? For undocumented students to become teachers.
Messaging. Oh, just okay. Okay, great. So I think the concern that has come up, it generally has to do with the negative perceptions on folks who are here without any kind of formal status. So the idea that what has been presented is that the idea of an educator who is undocumented being in the classroom is something that both moderate and conservative legislators aren't fond of. And so it doesn't become popular. I was like noting for folks in the space that when we talk about policy related to undocumented folks, we never actually say undocumented. So that term's never used in policy, even in just describing it. It's that someone without a status, someone without social security number, someone who's an excluded worker, because the term itself is so negative in the state of New York that if you attach it to any policy, it's not going to pass. And so it's difficult to frame it with these types of legislations, even when there's such a high need. So like the hate towards a specific group like overcomes the need of educators in the state.
That's a good point. You feel like you want to add something? The mic here. Mhm.
So my work, I'm on Long Island, and so teachers are, when we're looking at teacher pathways in early childhood specific, you don't have to be certified to be a lead teacher in the classroom. And so I think the Office of Children and Family Services, that is the regulatory agency for the entire state outside of New York City that oversees the credentialing requirements for lead teachers. And all that's required is the Child Development Associate credential, which is why, you know, my work really centers on how do we actually make these credentials of high quality. In my study, I actually have several undocumented students who are also employed in childcare centers because OCFS does not ask for Social Security. And so you can be employed and be a lead teacher in early childhood spaces as long as you're able to pass the background checks. So I think that's something to continue to kind of see as an opportunity to really create these career pathways for women and men who are interested in going into fields of early childhood education specific.
Thank you. Some of you provided information about, or recommendations on helping or improving, allowing for more folks to make their credentials valid once they come to the U.S. Another thing was also providing state aid for undocumented students. Why do you think that it is so difficult to make this proposal happen? Have you seen anybody else, or is there anyone out there conducting like a fiscal study of how much would it cost to New York State to facilitate or provide more help for undocumented students, and then the return that we can get out of that? And the same thing if we're helping more immigrants get their credentials and get to work immediately. Anyone who can comment on any of those things?
Just to briefly clarify, state aid is available for undocumented folks in the state of New York. It's just limited to funding that's administered by the Higher Education Services Corporation. There is one study, but it was done several years ago before the enactment of the New York State DREAM Act by Kenny Nisenhuser in the University of Connecticut, I believe, along with Blanca Vega, who is now at Rutgers, but I forget what was her previous university affiliation, showing kind of the fiscal benefit of having these state aid legislations in states like Texas, California. There's also several like fiscal studies on the benefit of DACA, right? Like the kind of economic boom that is created across the country in those individual states. And then again, like the hate towards this population seems to overpower like any other argument that is being made. But I think there are a lot of researchers that are speaking specifically about the financial benefits of these types of legislations.
And as of now, undocumented students are able to receive in-state tuition as well?
Yes. So in the state of New York, if you're undocumented, you can receive in-state tuition if you have attended a New York State high school for 2 or more years and graduated, or have a GED or high school equivalency from the state of New York. But if you don't have either of those, or if you like graduated high school in a year because you were like pushed through and you then apply for a university, the university then knows you have 1 year of high school and they will not give you in-state tuition.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So 2 quick things, I think, on refugees that arrive. Number one, I think we have to remember that paying for credentialing is an entrenched capitalist interest, and we have corporations that earn money, you know, evaluating those credits. So that's one issue. The second issue is, at least among private universities, they're also trying to have students pay for the credits. Again, there is sort of this sort of, you know, interest in having at least partially paying students to keep the university system intact. So in other words, it takes an act of the legislature to address those issues, because these are independent corporations that are earning money from this.
Thank you so much. And I think we do have to go back to the plenary and leave this cold room. So
Thank you so much.